The parlor of Blackwood Manor smelled of roses and rot. Margaret Blackwood sat rigid in her chair, dressed in perfect mourning black, her face pale beneath her veil. Around her, the important men of Savannah, Georgia had gathered, lawyers, bankers, neighbors who owned plantations just as grand as this one. The year was 1858, and the room buzzed with whispered speculation. Charles Blackwood was dead, heart failure at 52, and today his will would be read. Margaret's gloved hands gripped the armrests of her chair. She'd been married to Charles for 28 years, had given him a son who died in infancy, had managed his household, entertained his business associates, and turned a blind eye to his indiscretions. Now she would finally reap what she'd sown. The plantation, the house, the wealth, all of it would be hers. Or so she thought. Attorney Harrison Webb cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered to hear the last will and testament of Mr. Charles Edward Blackwood, dated March 15, 1858. 3 months before his death, Margaret noted. Charles had changed his will just 3 months ago and never mentioned it to her. A cold finger of dread touched her spine. Webb began to read, "I, Charles Edward Blackwood, being of sound mind and body." The standard language. Margaret barely listened. She was already planning what she'd do with her inheritance. Sell this cursed plantation and move to Charleston, or perhaps New York, somewhere far from the memories of a loveless marriage. "And to my wife, Margaret Ann Blackwood, I leave the sum of $500 and her personal effects." The room went silent. Margaret's head snapped up. "What?" Webb continued reading, his voice steady. "The remainder of my estate, including Blackwood Manor, all lands, properties, investments, and assets, I bequeath in full to Sarah Blackwood, a woman of color currently residing on this plantation." The parlor erupted. "This is madness." Margaret's brother Thomas shot to his feet. "Charles Blackwood has left his entire fortune to a slave." "Not a slave," Webb said quietly, still looking at the document. "According to the will, Sarah Blackwood was legally freed by manumission papers filed with the county clerk 15 years ago. She is a free woman." Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room spun around her. "Sarah, he left everything to Sarah." "This will is clearly invalid," Thomas was shouting now. "Written under duress, the man was ill, his mind was failing." "I examined Mr. Blackwood thoroughly before he signed this document," said a voice from the corner. Dr. Edward Collins stepped forward. He was in perfect health at the time, sound of mind and clear in his intentions. "I witnessed the signing myself." Margaret finally found her voice. "Where is she?" The words came out like poison. "Where is this woman?" "Right here, Mrs. Blackwood." Every head turned. Sarah stood in the doorway. She was 33 years old, tall and slender, with skin the color of warm honey and eyes that held a quiet dignity. She wore a simple gray dress, not the rough clothes of a field hand, but not the finery of the house either. Margaret had known Sarah for 15 years, had watched her move through the house like a ghost, had wondered, sometimes, about the way Charles looked at her, the way he disappeared to the library when Sarah brought his evening tea. But she'd never asked, never questioned, because to know was to acknowledge, and to acknowledge was to lose everything. Now she'd lost it anyway. "This is an outrage." Thomas moved toward Sarah, his face red with fury. "You think you can just walk in here and take what doesn't belong to you?" "I think," Sarah said quietly, "I can stand in a house where I've lived for 15 years and hear what a man chose to do with his own property." "You were his property." "I was freed in 1843, Sarah replied, her voice steady. "The papers are recorded with the county. You're welcome to verify that." Attorney Webb nodded. "I've seen the manumission papers myself. They're entirely legal." Margaret stood slowly, her legs trembling. She walked toward Sarah with measured steps. The room held its breath. The two women faced each other, one dressed in silk and mourning veils, the other in simple gray. But in that moment, everyone could see what Margaret had refused to see for 15 years. They had the same nose, the same cheekbones, the same slight build. Sarah wasn't just Charles Blackwood's former slave. She was his daughter. Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. "You knew, all this time you knew." Sarah met her eyes without flinching. "Yes, ma'am, I knew." "And you let me live here, thinking I was the mistress of this house." "You were the mistress," Sarah said. "I was just a girl trying to survive." Margaret slapped her. The crack echoed through the parlor. Sarah's head turned with the blow, but she didn't cry out, didn't raise a hand to defend herself. She just slowly straightened and looked at Margaret with something like pity. "Get out," Margaret hissed. "Get out of my house." "It's not your house anymore," Attorney Webb said firmly. "According to the will, Miss Sarah Blackwood is now the legal owner of this property. Mrs. Blackwood, you have 30 days to gather your belongings and vacate the premises." Margaret felt the world tilting. 30 days. After 28 years of marriage, she had 30 days and $500. "We'll fight this," Thomas said, grabbing his sister's arm. "We'll take it to court. No judge in Georgia will uphold a will that leaves a plantation to a—" "To a what?" Sarah asked quietly. "To his daughter, to someone who shares his blood. That's what you can't say, isn't it? That a man might actually acknowledge his own child." "You have no proof of that," Webb said quickly. "I don't need proof," Sarah replied. "I have the will, that's all the law requires." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm sorry this happened to you. I truly am, but I didn't ask for this. I didn't manipulate your husband or bewitch him or whatever you'll tell yourself to make sense of it. He made his choices. We all did." She looked around the room at the shocked faces of Savannah's elite. "And now we all have to live with them." After she left, the gathering dissolved into chaos. Men arguing about the legality of the will, women whispering about the scandal, Thomas demanding they find grounds to contest it. But Margaret just sat down and stared at nothing. She'd lost everything in a single afternoon. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that she'd seen this coming for years and convinced herself it didn't matter. Sarah's mother had been a house slave named Rebecca, beautiful, intelligent, the daughter of a white overseer and his enslaved housekeeper. Charles had purchased Rebecca shortly after his marriage to Margaret, when it became clear that Margaret struggled to conceive. Rebecca had been 15, Charles had been 24, and Margaret had been 23 and desperately pretending not to notice what happened when her husband visited the slave quarters. When Sarah was born a year later, Margaret had hoped Charles would sell them both, send them away where she wouldn't have to see the evidence of his betrayal every day. Instead, he'd kept them close, given Rebecca light duties, made sure Sarah learned to read and write. And then, when Sarah was 18 and Rebecca died of fever, Charles had freed Sarah and moved her into the main house. As a servant officially, but everyone knew better. Margaret had endured it, swallowed her rage and humiliation, because she was Charles Blackwood's wife, and that position came with security, with status, with wealth. Or so she'd thought. Now she had nothing. That night Margaret sat alone in her bedroom, the room she'd shared with Charles for nearly 3 decades. She looked at herself in the mirror, 46 years old, still handsome but fatting. No money except $500, no home except for 30 more days, no prospects except returning to her brother's house in shame. And somewhere in this manner, Sarah Blackwood, the woman who'd stolen everything, was probably sitting in the master's study, going through the books, learning how to run a plantation. Margaret's hands curled into fists. She'd been raised to be a Southern lady, to be gracious, gentle, submissive, but she'd also been raised to survive, and she wasn't going to let some upstart former slave take what should have been hers without a fight. If the law wouldn't help her, she'd find another way. She'd destroy Sarah Blackwood, one way or another, even if she had to burn Blackwood Manor to the ground to do it. Sarah Blackwood stood at the window of her father's study and watched the sun rise over fields she now owned. It felt surreal, wrong somehow, like wearing a dress that didn't quite fit. For 33 years she'd been property, then a freed servant, then something in between, a woman without a clear place in the world, too black to be Charles Blackwood's acknowledged daughter, too privileged to be just another former slave. Now she was a plantation owner, one of the wealthiest landowners in Georgia, and she had absolutely no idea what to do with it. "Miss Sarah." She turned to find Moses standing in the doorway. He was 60 years old, the plantation's head driver, the man who organized the work crews and reported to the overseer, a man who'd known her since she was born. "Moses," she said, "please come in." He hesitated. Slaves, even freed ones, just walk into the master's study. Old habits died hard. "It's all right," Sarah said gently. "Things are different now." Moses stepped inside but didn't sit. "The people are worried, Miss Sarah. They're hearing stories about Mrs. Blackwood trying to overturn the will, about the white folks in town saying you stole the plantation. They're scared of what's coming." Sarah nodded slowly. She'd expected this. Fear was the constant companion of enslaved people. Fear of being sold, fear of punishment, fear of the future changing in ways they couldn't control. "Tell them I'm not selling," she said, "and I'm not bringing in a new overseer. Everything stays the same for now." "With respect, Miss Sarah, everything already changed. You're the master now, whether you want to be or not." The word hit her like a physical blow. Master. That's what she was now, legally speaking, the owner of 200 human beings. The irony was suffocating. "I want to free them," Sarah said suddenly. "All of them. Issue manumission papers for every person on this plantation." Moses's eyes widened. "That would ruin you. The land ain't worth nothing without workers. You'd have to sell everything." "Then I'll sell everything." "And what happens to those 200 people when you do?" Moses asked quietly. "Where do they go? How do they eat? The law says freed slaves can't even stay in Georgia unless they have a white sponsor. You free them all at once, and they'll be rounded up and sold south before the week is out." Sarah sank into the chair behind the desk, her father's chair. Moses was right. She knew he was right. Freeing everyone immediately would be a moral statement, but it would destroy the very people she was trying to help. "So what do I do?" she asked. "Own them, profit from their labor, become exactly what I've always hated." Moses was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "You do what your father couldn't. You make this place different." Sarah looked up at him. "Different how?" "You let people earn their freedom. You pay them wages, real wages, not tokens. You teach them to read and write so they have skills when they leave. You make deals. Work here 5 years, get your freedom and enough money to start over somewhere safe." Moses leaned forward. "You can't save everyone overnight, Miss Sarah, but you can give them hope, and that's more than most of us ever had." Sarah stared at him. It was brilliant and dangerous, and probably illegal under Georgia law, but if she was careful. "It would take years," she said slowly, "and every plantation owner in the state would want to destroy me for it." "They already want to destroy you," Moses pointed out. "Might as well give them a good reason." For the first time since the will reading, Sarah smiled. "All right, let's do it, quietly at first. We'll start with—" The study door burst open. Margaret Blackwood stood there, her face flushed with rage and triumph. Behind her were 3 men Sarah didn't recognize, hard-looking men in dusty traveling clothes. "I told you she was here," Margaret said to the men. "In my husband's study, sitting in his chair like she has a right to it." The largest of the 3 men stepped forward. He had a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. "Miss Sarah Blackwood." "Yes," Sarah said, standing slowly. "I'm Sheriff Dawson from Chatham County. I have a warrant for your arrest." The world tilted. On what charge? Fraud and forgery, Margaret said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. We've found evidence that you manipulated my husband, that you forged his signature on that will, that you're nothing but a confidence woman who took advantage of a sick, dying man. That's a lie, Moses said sharply. Quiet, Dawson snapped at him. Then to Sarah, you'll need to come with me, miss. There'll be a hearing in 3 days. Until then, you'll be held in custody. Sarah's mind raced. This was it, Margaret's counterattack. Accuse Sarah of fraud, have her arrested, then contest the will while Sarah sat in jail unable to defend herself. I want to see the evidence, Sarah said. You'll see it at the hearing, Dawson replied. Now, are you coming peacefully, or do my deputies need to help you? Sarah looked at Moses, saw the helpless fury in his eyes. There was nothing he could do, nothing anyone could do. If she resisted, they'd arrest her anyway and probably beat her for it. If she went quietly, she'd at least have a chance to defend herself in court. I'll come peacefully, she said. As Dawson led her out, Margaret stepped close and whispered, You should have taken the $500 and disappeared, girl. Now you're going to lose everything, and when they hang you for fraud, I'll be there to watch. Sarah looked her in the eye. You must have loved him very much, to hate me this badly. Margaret's face twisted. I never loved him, I endured him. For 28 years I endured being married to a man who looked at me like I was a duty, who saved all his tenderness for slaves, who humiliated me every day of my life. Her voice dropped to a hiss. So no, I don't hate you because I loved him. I hate you because you got what should have been mine, and I'm going to take it back. Sarah was led out of Blackwood Manor in chains. The Savannah jail was a stone building that smelled of mildew and despair. Sarah's cell was barely 6 feet across, with a straw mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner. She sat on the mattress and tried to think. Margaret had found evidence of forgery, which meant she'd either fabricated it or convinced someone to lie. Either way, Sarah was in serious trouble. If convicted of fraud, she'd lose everything: the plantation, the will, possibly her freedom. Judges had been known to re-enslave freed blacks who committed crimes. And even if she was acquitted, the trial would take months. During that time, Margaret would be running Blackwood Manor, would probably sell off assets, pocket the money, maybe even sell some of the slaves south before Sarah could stop her. Sarah had to get out, had to find a way to prove the will was legitimate and expose Margaret's lies. But how? On the 2nd day of her imprisonment, she had a visitor. Attorney Harrison Webb appeared at her cell door, looking uncomfortable. Miss Blackwood, I've come to discuss your legal representation. Did Margaret send you? Sarah asked bitterly. No, Webb said. I came on my own because I'm troubled by what's happening. He glanced at the guard who'd moved to the far end of the corridor. Miss Blackwood, I was there when your father signed that will. I watched him do it. He was of sound mind. There was no coercion, no forgery. Then tell that to the judge. I will, but I'm not sure it will be enough. Mrs. Blackwood has found witnesses who claim to have seen you forging documents in your father's study. They're prepared to testify. They're lying. I know, but they're white, respectable citizens, and you're, he trailed off. A black woman claiming to own a plantation, Sarah finished. Yes, I understand how this works. Webb cleared his throat. There may be another way, a piece of evidence that could prove the will's legitimacy beyond doubt. Sarah leaned forward. What? Your father kept a diary. He wrote in it every night for 30 years. If we could find it, if it contains entries about his intentions, about why he made the will, it would be powerful evidence. Where is this diary? I don't know. He kept it hidden, said there were things in it that would destroy reputations if they ever became public. Webb lowered his voice. But he told me once that he kept it somewhere only someone who truly knew him would think to look, somewhere significant. Sarah's mind began to work. Somewhere significant, somewhere only someone who knew Charles Blackwood intimately would understand. And suddenly, she knew exactly where it was. "Mr. Webb," she said slowly, "I need you to get a message to Moses. Tell him to go to my mother's grave, in the cemetery behind the chapel. Tell him to look beneath the foundation stone." Webb's eyes widened with understanding. Rebecca's grave. The place Charles visited every week for 15 years, even after her death. Of course, that's where he would hide his truths. "I'll send word immediately," Webb said. "But Miss Blackwood, if we're wrong, if the diary isn't there or doesn't help your case—" "Then I'll hang for fraud," Sarah said quietly, "and Margaret Blackwood will get exactly what she wants." Moses found the diary exactly where Sarah said it would be. Wrapped in oilcloth and buried in a metal box beneath the foundation stone of Rebecca's grave marker, the leather-bound journal had been hidden for 15 years. Moses brought it to Attorney Webb at midnight, moving through the shadows like a man being hunted. Because in a way he was. Margaret Blackwood had hired men to watch the plantation, to follow anyone who might be helping Sarah, to ensure that no evidence emerged that could save her. Webb read the diary in one sitting. When he finished, his hands were shaking. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning. Webb arrived at the courthouse carrying the diary like it was made of glass. Sarah was brought from her cell, still in chains, to face Judge Theodore Harrington, a 60-year-old magistrate known for his harsh treatment of freed blacks. The courtroom was packed. Everyone in Savannah wanted to see the scandal resolved. Plantation owners sat in judgment of this uppity former slave who thought she could own land. Abolitionists whispered prayers for justice. And Margaret Blackwood sat in the front row, dressed in elegant black, looking like righteousness personified. The prosecutor presented his case first. He called witnesses who swore they'd seen Sarah and Charles Blackwood study, hunched over documents, practicing his signature. He produced a handwriting expert who claimed the signature on the will showed signs of forgery. It was all lies, but it was convincing lies. When it was Webb's turn, he stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the defense calls only one witness, Charles Edward Blackwood himself." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "The man is dead," Judge Harrington said impatiently. "Yes, Your Honor, but he left testimony nonetheless." Webb held up the diary. "This is Charles Blackwood's personal journal, kept faithfully for 30 years. It contains entries that speak directly to his intentions regarding his will and to the character of the woman he chose to inherit his estate." Margaret half rose from her seat. "Objection, that diary could be fabricated." "The handwriting can be verified," Webb said calmly, "and I have witnesses who saw Mr. Blackwood writing in this very journal for decades." He looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I request permission to read selected entries to the court." Harrington considered, then nodded. "Proceed, but be brief." Webb opened the diary. The courtroom fell silent. Entry from June 12, 1825, Webb read. "Today I married Margaret Ann Preston. She is beautiful and refined, everything a man of my station should want. I feel nothing for her, but perhaps love will come in time." Margaret's face went white. Webb continued. Entry from October 3, 1826. "Margaret tells me she is not with child again. 3 years of marriage and still no heir. I see the disappointment in her eyes, but greater than her disappointment is my relief. I do not want to bring a child into this cold, empty union." "That's enough," Margaret started. But Webb kept reading. Entry from March 15, 1828. "I have purchased a new house slave. Her name is Rebecca. She is 15 years old and looks at me with eyes that hold more warmth than I have seen in my own wife's face in 3 years of marriage. God forgive me, but I am drawn to her." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Webb's voice grew stronger. Entry from December 7, 1829. "Rebecca delivered a daughter this morning. The child has my eyes, my nose. She is mine in every way that matters. I have named her Sarah, and though I can never publicly acknowledge her, I swear before God that I will protect her, provide for her, give her everything I can within the constraints of this cursed system." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. She'd never heard these words, never known her father felt this way. Webb flipped forward in the diary. Entry from April 22, 1843. "Today I filed manumission papers for Sarah. She is 18, a woman now, brilliant and kind despite everything this world has tried to teach her otherwise. I cannot give her my name publicly, cannot acknowledge her as my daughter, but I can give her freedom. It is not enough. It will never be enough, but it is all I have to offer." More pages turned. Entry from September 8, 1851. "Margaret confronted me today about Sarah, asked me why I keep her close, why I favor her. I told her the truth that Sarah is my daughter. Margaret's face went cold. She said, 'I have endured many humiliations as your wife, Charles, but this is the greatest, that you would love the child of a slave more than you love me.' I had no answer, because it is true." Margaret was crying now, silent tears running down her face. Webb found the entry he'd been looking for. Entry from March 15, 1858. "I have made my decision. My will is written and witnessed. I leave everything to Sarah, the plantation, the house, all my worldly goods. Margaret will call it cruelty. Perhaps it is, but it is also justice. Sarah is my child, my blood. She deserves what any legitimate heir would receive, and more than that, she will use this inheritance wisely. She has a good heart, untainted by the corruption that has poisoned people like Margaret and myself. If anyone can find a better way forward, it will be her." Webb closed the diary. "Your Honor, these entries span 30 years. They detail Charles Blackwood's intentions with perfect clarity. He knew exactly what he was doing when he made that will. He was providing for his daughter, the only child he ever had." Judge Harrington looked at the prosecutor. "Do you have any response to this evidence?" The prosecutor stood, but he had nothing. No way to refute Charles Blackwood's own words, written in his own hand over 3 decades. "The charges are dismissed," Harrington said heavily. "The will stands as written. Miss Sarah Blackwood is the legal owner of Blackwood Manor and all associated properties." The courtroom exploded. Sarah felt the chains removed from her wrists, felt Webb's hand on her shoulder congratulating her, but she barely heard any of it, because she was watching Margaret. The older woman sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, her perfect composure finally shattered. She looked small, broken, a woman who just heard her dead husband confess that he'd never loved her, that he'd always chosen someone else. Sarah walked over to her. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said quietly. Margaret looked up, expecting triumph, expecting cruelty. Instead, Sarah said, "You were right about what you said at the house. He should have loved you. You deserved better than a man who looked at you like a duty. I'm sorry that happened to you." Margaret stared at her. "You're apologizing to me." "I'm acknowledging your pain," Sarah said. "Just because he wronged you doesn't mean he was right to give everything to me. Just because I inherited his property doesn't mean I inherited his debts to you." She paused. "The will gave you $500. I'm increasing it to $5,000. And you can stay at Blackwood Manor as long as you need to find somewhere else to live, with dignity." "Why?" Margaret whispered. "Why would you do that?" "Because hating each other won't fix anything," Sarah said simply. "And because I know what it's like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone else's choices. I won't do that to you if I can help it." She turned to leave, then looked back. "You said you endured him for 28 years. You don't have to endure anything anymore, Mrs. Blackwood. You're free now, too." 3 months later, Margaret Blackwood left Savannah for Charleston, carrying a bank draft for $5,000 and a letter of recommendation from Sarah that opened doors in society that would have otherwise been closed to a divorced woman. They never spoke again, but years later, Margaret would tell people that the greatest surprise of her life was discovering that the woman who stole her inheritance taught her what grace actually looked like. Sarah stood in the study, her study now, and looked out at Blackwood Manor, at the fields where people still worked in bondage, at the future she now had to build. Moses had been right. She couldn't save everyone overnight. But she could start. The next day, Sarah implemented her plan. Every person enslaved at Blackwood would be offered a contract, work for 7 years, receive wages, learn to read and write. At the end of 7 years, freedom. With enough money to start over somewhere safe. The plantation owners of Georgia were outraged, called her a traitor to her race, to her class. Sarah didn't care. Because she'd learned something from her father's diary, from his decades of silent regret and hidden truths. Living authentically, even when it was dangerous, was better than living comfortably while betraying yourself. She would build something new at Blackwood Manor. Something that looked like justice. Sarah should have known the peace wouldn't last. 6 months after the hearing, Blackwood Manor was thriving in ways no one expected. The freed contract workers, that's what Sarah called them, worked harder than they ever had as slaves, because now they had hope, they had wages, they had futures. Sarah had converted the old library into a schoolroom. Every evening after the day's work was done, adults and children gathered to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. Moses taught alongside Sarah, along with 2 other freed people who'd been educated in secret over the years. It was working, slowly, carefully, but it was working. The other plantation owners watched with growing fury. At the Savannah Gentlemen's Club, men in expensive suits drank brandy and discussed the Sarah Blackwood problem. "She's paying slaves wages," one plantation owner said, his face red with anger. "Actual money, do you know what that does? Now my workers are asking why they don't get paid, asking why Blackwood's people get to learn to read. It's spreading like a disease." "She's destroying the natural order," another agreed, "making them think they're equal to us." The eldest among them, a man named Richard Pemberton who owned 3 plantations and 200 slaves, set down his glass with deliberate care. "Then we stop her," he said simply. "How? The law says she owns that plantation fair and square." Pemberton smiled coldly. "I didn't say anything about the law." 3 nights later, riders came to Blackwood Manor. Sarah woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of screaming. She ran to her window and saw flames rising from the schoolhouse. Figures on horseback circled the building, throwing torches, their faces hidden by white hoods. Her blood turned to ice. She knew what this was, who they were. Night riders, men who enforced the racial order through terror and violence. They'd been around for decades, though they'd reorganize and rename themselves many times. Different names, same purpose: keep black people afraid and powerless. Sarah grabbed her robe and ran downstairs. Outside, people were running everywhere, some trying to fight the fire, others hiding their children, everyone terrified. Moses found her in the chaos. "Miss Sarah, you need to hide. They're looking for you." "I won't hide while they burn my people's school." "It's not just the school." Moses pointed toward the slave quarters. More fires were starting. "They're burning everything you built, and if they find you, they'll kill you." As if to prove his point, a rider spotted Sarah. He wheeled his horse toward her, raising something. Moses shoved her aside just as the shot rang out. The bullet caught Moses in the shoulder. He went down hard. "No," Sarah dropped beside him, pressing her hands against the wound. The rider was coming back, reloading. And then someone stepped in front of Sarah. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the controlled precision of a trained fighter. Sarah had never seen him before. He wasn't one of her workers, but he positioned himself between her and the rider like a human shield. "That's far enough," the stranger said. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. The rider laughed. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who doesn't like seeing women and old men shot in the back." "This ain't your business, stranger. Ride on." "Can't do that." The rider raised his gun. The stranger moved faster than Sarah thought possible, grabbed the horse's bridle, yanked the rider off balance, and pulled him from the saddle in one smooth motion. The gun went off harmlessly into the air. The stranger had the rider pinned before he hit the ground. "Call them off," the stranger said quietly. "Now. Go to hell." The stranger pressed his forearm against the man's throat. "I spent 10 years in the army, 6 of those fighting in Mexico. I've killed men in ways you can't imagine. So I'll ask one more time, call them off, or I'll make sure you never give another order." Something in his voice, the absolute certainty of it, made the rider believe him. "Pull back," the rider choked out to his companions. "Pull back." The other riders hesitated, then wheeled their horses and disappeared into the darkness, leaving fires burning in their wake. The stranger let the rider up. "If you come back here, I'll kill you. That's not a threat, that's a promise." The man scrambled to his horse and rode off. Sarah finally found her voice. "Who are you?" The stranger turned to face her. In the firelight, she could see him clearly now, maybe 35 years old, with sun-weathered skin and gray eyes that had seen too much. He had the build of a soldier and the scars to match. "Name's James Cooper," he said. "Captain James Cooper, formerly of the 7th Infantry Regiment, now just a man who happened to be passing through." He looked at Moses, still bleeding on the ground. "We need to get him inside. That shoulder needs attention." Between Sarah and 3 other workers, they got Moses into the house. The stranger, Cooper, proved he knew field medicine. He cleaned and bandaged the wound with steady hands. "You've done this before," Sarah observed. "Too many times." As he worked, Sarah studied him. "Why did you help us?" Cooper was quiet for a long moment. "Because I'm tired of watching bullies hurt people who can't fight back, and because," he looked up at her, "I know who you are, Miss Blackwood. I know what you're trying to do here, and I think it matters." "How do you know about me?" "I read about your trial in the newspapers, about the will, about your plans for this plantation." He tied off the bandage. "I was in New Orleans when I read it, thought to myself, now that's either the bravest woman in Georgia or the most foolish. Decided I needed to see for myself which one you were." "And you're brave," Cooper said. "Probably too brave for your own good. Those men tonight, they'll come back, and next time they'll bring more riders, more guns." Sarah felt her stomach twist. She knew he was right. The night riders had been driven off, but they'd return. They always did. "What do I do?" she asked quietly. Cooper looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a decision. "You let me help you. I'm a soldier without a war. A man with certain skills and no particular place to be. If you'll have me, I'll stay. Teach your people to defend themselves. Set up watches. Prepare for when they come back." "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm tired of fighting for causes I don't believe in," Cooper said simply. "The army sent me to Mexico to conquer people who never did me harm. Sent me to Florida to hunt Seminoles whose only crime was wanting to be free. I'm done fighting other people's wars." He met her eyes. "But this, what you're building here, this is worth fighting for." Sarah looked at this scarred stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere and saved her life. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to question his motives. But she was desperate, and she believed him. "All right," she said, "stay, help us. But I need to know, are you running from something, Captain Cooper?" His jaw tightened. "Aren't we all running from something, Miss Blackwood?" It wasn't an answer, but it was honest enough. "There's a cabin behind the main house," Sarah said. "It was my father's private workshop. You can stay there." Cooper nodded. "I'll start training people tomorrow, but Miss Blackwood, you need to understand something. I can teach them to fight, to defend this place. But if those plantation owners decide to destroy you, they'll bring the law, bring militias, bring forces we can't fight. Then what do I do? You make what you're doing here so visible, so public, that they can't destroy you quietly. You need allies, powerful ones, People who can protect you when I can't. Sarah thought of the abolitionists in the North, the journalists who'd covered her trial, the politicians who secretly opposed slavery but were too afraid to say so publicly. "I'll write letters," she said. "Tell our story, make sure the world is watching." "Good," Cooper said, "because the only thing bullies fear is exposure." Over the next 3 months, Sarah did exactly that. She wrote to newspapers in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, told them about the experiment at Blackwood Manor, about freed people learning to read, earning wages, preparing for lives beyond slavery. Some papers ignored her, but others published her letters, and slowly people began to pay attention. Frederick Douglass mentioned Blackwood Manor in a speech. Harriet Beecher Stowe requested to visit. Northern abolitionists started citing Sarah's work as proof that black people could thrive when given opportunity. And with every article, every mention, every letter, Sarah became more famous, more protected. The plantation owners of Georgia seethed with rage, but they couldn't act openly now, not when newspapers across the North were watching. Meanwhile, Cooper kept his promise. He trained 24 of the strongest workers in basic defense, not to attack, Sarah forbade that, but to protect themselves and others if the writers returned. He also taught Sarah to shoot. "I don't want to kill anyone," she said, holding the pistol awkwardly. "You won't have to," Cooper replied, "but they need to know you can, that's different." Late one night, as they stood on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah asked him the question that had been nagging at her for months. "What are you really doing here, James? And don't tell me you just happen to be passing through. Men like you don't just appear when they're needed." Cooper was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I had a wife, back in Ohio. Her name was Mary. She was everything good in my life." Sarah waited. "We helped runaways on the Underground Railroad, hid them in our barn, helped them move north to freedom. We did it for 5 years, never lost a single person." His voice went flat. "And then slave catchers figured out what we were doing. They came one night while I was away, burned our farm. Mary was inside." Sarah's breath caught. "I couldn't save her," Cooper continued. "Couldn't save our home. Couldn't do anything but bury her and try to find a reason to keep living." He looked at Sarah. "When I read about you, about what you were trying to build here, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was the reason." Sarah reached out and took his hand. "I'm sorry about your wife." "So am I." They stood together in silence, two broken people trying to build something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. And in that moment, Sarah realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. She had people who believed in her vision, warriors willing to defend it, and allies powerful enough to protect it. The night riders would come again. The plantation owners would keep trying to destroy her. But Sarah Blackwood wasn't the same scared girl who'd stood in that courtroom 6 months ago. She was a woman who'd found her purpose, her strength, her voice. And she wasn't giving up without a fight. The winter of 1859 was the coldest Georgia had seen in 20 years. But inside Blackwood Manor, something was warming, something the plantation owners couldn't freeze, no matter how hard they tried. Hope. 23 people had completed their 7-year contracts early. Sarah had decided anyone who could read, write, and demonstrate a trade skill could earn their freedom ahead of schedule. She gave each of them manumission papers, $100, and letters of introduction to abolitionist contacts in the North. Some stayed and signed on as paid employees. Others left for Philadelphia, New York, Boston, walking into freedom with their heads high. Every departure was a small miracle. Every success story was a crack in the foundation of slavery itself. The plantation owners met again, this time in secret. "She's made a mockery of everything we stand for," Richard Pemberton said, his voice shaking with rage. 23 freed slaves in 6 months. She's paying the others wages, teaching them to read. And now, she started accepting runaways from other plantations. This last part was true, though Sarah didn't advertise it. Word had spread through the slave network that Blackwood Manor was a sanctuary, that if you could make it there, Sarah Blackwood would protect you. She'd hidden 6 runaways in the past month alone. Cooper had helped them move north, using old underground railroad routes he'd memorized during his time in Ohio. "We need to end this," another plantation owner said, "before it spreads, before every slave in Georgia thinks they can just run to Blackwood Manor and be free." "The newspapers are watching," someone pointed out. "If we move against her openly, we'll have every abolitionist in the North screaming about it." Pemberton smiled coldly. "Then we don't move openly, we use the law." He pulled out a document. "I've been in contact with the governor's office. They're willing to pass an emergency act, a special law targeting Blackwood Manor specifically. It would make it illegal to pay slaves wages, illegal to educate them, illegal to harbor runaways. Violation would result in immediate seizure of the property." "Can they do that?" "They can do whatever they want. This is Georgia, we make the laws here." The vote was unanimous. Within 2 weeks, the Plantation Labor Act of 1859 was passed by the Georgia legislature. Sarah received notice on a Tuesday morning. She stood in her study, reading the document with growing disbelief. The law was explicitly designed to destroy everything she'd built. Every practice she'd implemented was now illegal, and she had 30 days to comply or lose Blackwood Manor. Cooper found her there, the letter crumpled in her hand. "They've outlawed everything," she said, her voice hollow. "The wages, the education, all of it. If I don't stop, they'll seize the plantation and sell everyone south." Cooper took the letter and read it. His jaw tightened. "This isn't a law, this is theft dressed up in legal language." "What do I do, James?" Sarah's voice broke. "If I comply, I betray everyone who trusted me. If I resist, I lose everything and they all get sold anyway." Cooper was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a third option." "What?" "You don't fight Georgia, you leave it." Sarah stared at him. "Leave? Where would we go?" "North, across state lines where Georgia law doesn't apply. There are places, settlements of freed blacks where you could rebuild, start over." "That's impossible. I have 200 people here. How do I move 200 people north without being caught?" "Carefully," Cooper said, "and with help." Over the next week, Cooper sent messages to every underground railroad contact he'd ever known, called in favors, made plans. Sarah sold assets quietly, jewelry, furniture, anything that could be converted to cash without drawing attention. And she told the people of Blackwood Manor the truth. They could stay and be re-enslaved under the new law, or they could run. Together, all of them. The vote was unanimous. They would run. On the night of March 15, 1860, exactly 2 years after Charles Blackwood had signed his will, 200 people left Blackwood Manor forever. They moved in groups of 20, traveling different routes, meeting at predetermined points. Cooper had mapped it all out with military precision. Some groups went by wagon, others walked. A few traveled by boat along the coast. Sarah stayed with the last group, making sure everyone got out safely before she left. As she stood on the porch of Blackwood Manor one final time, she thought of her father, wondered what he would think of this moment. She was abandoning the plantation he'd built, destroying the legacy he'd left her. But she was saving the people, and she thought, hoped, that would matter more to him than the land. Sarah set fire to the main house herself. She wouldn't let the plantation owners have it, wouldn't let them profit from what her father had built. She watched Blackwood Manor burn, then turned and walked into the darkness. Behind her, flames lit up the night sky. Ahead, 200 people were running toward freedom. The journey north took 3 months. It was brutal. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day. Slave catchers hunted them, Bounty hunters tracked them. They lost people along the way, some gave up and turned back, too afraid to continue. Others were captured. But most made it. 173 people crossed into Pennsylvania in June of 1860. Sarah used the money from her sold assets to purchase land outside Philadelphia, a farm that could house everyone while they figured out their next steps. It wasn't a plantation, it was a community. And it was free. 2 years later, when the Civil War finally came, Sarah Blackwood was running a school for freed slaves in Philadelphia. She taught hundreds of children to read and write, prepared them for lives beyond what the old world had said was possible for people who looked like them. Captain James Cooper joined the Union Army, this time fighting for a cause he believed in. He led black regiments into battle, former slaves who took up arms to destroy the system that had once owned them. He wrote to Sarah every week. And when the war was over, he came home to her. They married in 1866, in a small ceremony attended by people who'd made that desperate run from Georgia 6 years earlier. Margaret Blackwood sent a gift, a silver tea service, along with a note that said simply, "Congratulations, you were braver than I ever was." Sarah never learned what happened to Blackwood Manor after she burned it. She heard rumors that the land was sold, that it changed hands several times, that nothing ever grew quite right on it after the fire. She didn't care, because she'd learned the most important lesson of her life. Property could be taken, land could be lost, buildings could burn. But freedom, real freedom, couldn't be destroyed. It lived in the hearts of people who refused to be broken, in communities that chose each other over safety, in the courage to walk away from everything you've ever known toward something better. Charles Blackwood had tried to give her freedom through a will. But Sarah Blackwood had given it to herself, and to 200 others, by having the courage to choose it when it mattered most. Years later, when people asked her about the plantation master who willed everything to a slave, Sarah would smile and correct them. "He willed me property. I had to will myself freedom, and those are two very different things." She lived to be 87 years old, taught thousands of children, watched some of them become doctors, lawyers, teachers, and leaders. And she never once regretted burning Blackwood Manor to the ground. Because some legacies are worth more than land. And freedom, earned, chosen, fought for, was the greatest inheritance of all.